At 9:47 p.m., when this orchestra swelled and the ballroom lights dimmed for Orion Global's anniversary toast, Daniel Reed realized he had been holding his breath for most of the night. The hotel's grand hall glittered like a glass cathedral. Crystal chandeliers, mirrored pillars, champagne flutes raised by people who spoke in percentages and power. But Daniel stood at the edge of it all as if he were watching someone else's life. He wore a dark suit that fit his shoulders and a tired smile that never reached his eyes, the kind of smile a single father learned to wear when he couldn't afford to be rude yet couldn't afford to be seen. Across the room, Evelyn Carter moved like a law of nature. Billionaire CEO, founder, the woman who could silence a boardroom with a lifted brow. She accepted applause with the same calm she used to sign acquisitions, and she did not look toward Daniel until she did. The glance lasted less than a second, but it hit him with the clean shock of cold water, because it wasn't a CEO's polite acknowledgement of an employee. It was something sharper, more personal, as if she had been searching for him and had finally found the only person in the room she couldn't control by money, fear, or flattery. Daniel tried to look away, because he had learned the hard way that some doors, once opened, never truly closed. But the next moment, Evelyn crossed the crowd with an intent that cut through the music, the laughter, the camera flashes. She reached him without hesitation, fingers closing around his wrist, warm, firm, unreasonably human. And before Daniel could speak, before he could remember the rules that kept his life stable for Lucas, she pulled him through a side corridor veiled in velvet. The noise fell away. A private executive restroom, a door that shut with a soft click that sounded final. The air smelled faintly of citrus and expensive perfume. Daniel's pulse hammered like a warning he could not ignore. Evelyn didn't touch him again, not yet, but she stepped close enough that her breath brushed his ear and her voice dropped into a whisper that did not ask permission. "This stays between us." In that instant, Daniel understood the true danger wasn't scandal or gossip or the imbalance of power. It was the way his loneliness answered her loneliness, like it had been waiting for a name. Daniel had not always been this careful. Before grief carved him hollow, he had been a man who laughed loudly, who kissed his wife in the kitchen just because the world felt kind. Then one wet night on a highway, a careless driver, a scream of tires, a phone call that turned time into ash. Emily was gone, and Daniel was left with Lucas, 6 years old then, all wide eyes and questions Daniel couldn't survive if he tried to answer honestly. So he built a life from routine the way some men build fortunes. Early mornings, packed lunches, homework at the small kitchen table, bedtime stories read with a steady voice even when his chest hurt. He took a job at Orion Global, not because it promised glory, but because it promised stability, insurance, a future he could measure. At work, he was the dependable one, the analyst who solved problems and disappeared. He avoided office parties because they reminded him how easily a moment could become a regret. Tonight, he had come only because Lucas's school needed a donation Daniel couldn't afford, and a networking conversation might lead to a raise. He told himself he could endure 2 hours of polite suffering for his son. He did not plan for Evelyn Carter. Evelyn had noticed Daniel long before he became a secret. The first time he spoke in a strategy meeting, he did it without performance. While others offered ideas as if tossing coins into her lap, Daniel laid out a solution with clean logic and then sat down as if he didn't care whether she approved. Evelyn, who spent her life surrounded by hunger disguised as admiration, felt something in her chest shift. Annoyance at first, then curiosity, then a quiet fascination she refused to name. She asked for his input again the next week, then the next, telling herself it was efficiency. But the truth was simpler. Daniel Reed never looked at her like a prize. Sometimes he looked at her like a person, and that felt more dangerous than any enemy. In the restroom, Evelyn watched him the way a woman watches a storm she has summoned. Under the bright mirror lights, Daniel's face looked younger and older at once. Lines of fatigue around his eyes, the kind that came from sleepless nights and responsibilities that didn't allow weakness. He stood rigidly by the marble sink, hands braced on the counter as if it were the only solid thing in the room. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice low, steady, but there was a tremor beneath it that betrayed him. Evelyn's mouth tightened, not in anger but in restraint. "Neither should I," she replied. She held his gaze, and for the first time all night her composure looked like what it was, a mask that had started to crack. "I saw you with Sophia," she added, then stopped as if surprised by her own confession. The words sounded absurd coming from her. Evelyn Carter, jealous. Daniel's brow furrowed. She was asking about the fundraising project. "And you smiled," Evelyn said, as if that were the crime. Daniel let out a breath that might have been a laugh in another life. "I smile at people," he said, and then, because honesty was the only defense he had left, he added, "It doesn't mean anything." Evelyn stepped closer, and the space between them narrowed until Daniel could smell her perfume and something else. Tiredness, maybe, or the heat of a long-held loneliness. "It meant something to me," she said softly. The confession landed between them like glass. Daniel straightened, the instinct to protect himself rising fast. "Ms. Carter, Evelyn," he corrected, because her closeness made formality feel like a lie. "I have a son." Evelyn's eyes flickered. "I know." Daniel froze. "How?" "Because I pay attention," she said, and there was no arrogance in it, only a plain truth. "I saw the way you leave early on Tuesdays. I saw you decline invitations without making excuses. I asked security for the footage of the charity run last month and watched you cross the finish line with a boy on your shoulders like he was your whole world." Daniel's throat tightened. He hated that she had looked into his life without asking, and he hated more that her words made something warm and aching rise inside him. "Then you know why this is impossible," he said. Evelyn's gaze did not waver. "I know why this is frightening," she corrected. "Impossible is a word people use when they don't want to risk pain." Daniel swallowed. "You're my CEO." Evelyn's smile was thin, almost sad. "And you're the only man in this building who doesn't want anything from me," she murmured. "Do you know what that does to a woman who's been wanted her whole life like an asset?" Daniel's hands curled into fists. Somewhere beyond the door, the party roared on, oblivious. In here, everything felt exposed. "Why me?" he asked, the question sharp with self-defense. Evelyn's eyes softened in a way that made her look younger, less like a headline. "Because you're not dazzled," she said. "Because you carry grief and still show up. Because when you speak, you mean it." She lifted a hand as if to touch his cheek, then stopped herself at the last second, fingers hovering in the air like she was relearning what it meant to want something she couldn't buy. Daniel's heart pounded, not with triumph, but with terror. He thought of Lucas asleep at home with Daniel's sister watching him. He thought of the small apartment, the cereal bowls, the bedtime stories. He thought of how one wrong decision could destabilize the fragile world he had built. And yet, when Evelyn whispered again, her voice barely audible, it wasn't a command this time. It was a plea. "Just tell me you feel something," she said. "Tell me I'm not the only one who can't breathe." Daniel's lips parted, and the truth almost escaped. Because he did feel something, something he had buried beneath duty and grief. But he forced himself to look away, to glance at the mirror and see a man who couldn't afford to be reckless. "This stays between us," he repeated, not as agreement but as warning. Evelyn's gaze sharpened. "So you will keep it," she said, and for the first time that night, her CEO voice returned, controlled, clipped, but beneath it, pain flickered. "Not because I'm your boss," she added, "but because if anyone knew they would destroy you to get to me." The words hit Daniel like a slap of cold reality. He understood then. Secrecy was not romance. Secrecy was survival. "I won't be your weakness," he said quietly. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "You think you have a choice?" she asked, and then her shoulders sank as if she hated herself for the question. "I didn't plan this," she admitted. "I didn't plan to want you." Daniel stared at her, and for a breath he saw the woman beneath the empire, alone, exhausted, hungry for something real. He wanted to comfort her. He wanted to step forward and take that hovering hand, to tell her she didn't have to be iron every second of her life. But he heard Lucas's voice in his mind. "Dad, are you coming to my school play?" And duty anchored him. "I have to go," he said. Evelyn nodded once, her face smoothing back into composure like a curtain being drawn. "Go," she said, and as Daniel reached for the door, she added, almost inaudible, "Daniel, If you walk out and pretend this didn't happen, you'll be lying to yourself." He paused with his hand on the handle. "Sometimes lying is how you keep a child safe," he said without turning. Then he left. The party lights hit him like a spotlight. People smiled. Someone clapped him on the shoulder. Sophia waved from across the room. Daniel forced his face into neutrality and walked toward the exit, feeling as if he had stepped out of a room where oxygen existed into a world that was suddenly too thin. That night, Lucas was already asleep when Daniel got home. His son lay sprawled across the bed with a superhero blanket half kicked to the floor, cheeks flushed with dreams. Daniel sat on the edge of the mattress and watched him for a long time, the way a man watches the only thing he cannot lose. He brushed Lucas's hair back gently, and the tenderness nearly broke him. In the kitchen, he poured himself a glass of water and held it with both hands until the trembling stopped. His phone buzzed once, an email notification, a calendar update. Nothing from Evelyn, of course nothing. A woman like her didn't text in the heat of impulse. She calculated, even when she hurt. Daniel told himself that meant it could end here. It should end here. But the next morning at Orion Global, he walked into the elevator and found Evelyn already inside. She stood alone, staring at the numbers above the doors as if they were the only safe thing to look at. Her posture was flawless. Her face was calm. Yet when the elevator doors closed and the small space sealed them together, she shifted her gaze to him. No one else was there. No witnesses. Daniel felt his stomach drop. Evelyn did not speak at first. Then, softly, she said, "Good morning, Daniel." The simple phrase carried more intimacy than any touch. He nodded. "Good morning, Ms. Carter." Her jaw flexed. "You don't have to do that," she murmured. "Yes, I do," Daniel replied, and the firmness surprised him. "For Lucas." Evelyn's eyes flickered, and something like respect slid in beside the longing. "You love him," she said, not a question. "He's my whole life," Daniel answered. The elevator dinged on her floor. The doors opened. Evelyn stepped out, then paused as if deciding something. "Bring the Henderson file to my office at 7, she said in a voice loud enough to be professional if anyone had been there. Then she lowered it, so only he could hear. "And Daniel, don't disappear." She walked away before he could answer. That evening, Daniel sat at his desk long after most of the building emptied, staring at the Henderson file without reading a word. At home, Lucas would be doing homework. Daniel's sister would be waiting to hand him a packed container of leftovers and give him the look that said, "You're working too much again." Daniel should have gone home. Instead, at 7 sharp, he knocked on Evelyn's office door and stepped into a world of glass walls and city lights. Evelyn stood by the window, looking down at the streets as if she were watching a life she didn't belong to. When she turned, Daniel saw exhaustion in her eyes that no makeup could hide. "You came," she said quietly. "You asked," Daniel replied. Evelyn's mouth curved faintly. "No one says no to me," she admitted. "You did." Daniel held the file like a shield. "I didn't say no," he corrected. "I said it's dangerous." Evelyn exhaled, and for a moment the billionaire CEO looked like a woman who simply needed to be heard. "Do you know what it's like," she said, "to be surrounded by people every day and still feel completely alone?" Daniel's grip loosened slightly. He did know. He knew the loneliness of widower nights, the ache of a bed too large, the silence that screamed. Evelyn walked to her desk and sat, not behind it like a boss, but at the corner, like a person trying not to hide. "I watched you with your son in that footage," she continued, voice softer. "You looked real, like your life had meaning beyond winning." Daniel swallowed. "It's not easy," he said. "Meaning rarely is," Evelyn replied. She looked up, and the vulnerability in her gaze was the most frightening thing Daniel had ever seen on her. "I'm tired of everyone wanting something," she whispered. "I'm tired of being a headline. I'm tired of being admired in ways that feel like hunger." Daniel's heart pounded. "And you think I'm different," he said, not accusing but cautious. "I know you are," Evelyn said, "because you don't look at me like I'm a prize." Daniel's voice came out rougher than he intended. "Maybe because prizes are things people can take. You're not something anyone can take." Evelyn's eyes widened at the bluntness, then her lips parted as if she might smile. But she didn't. Instead, she said, "Then take nothing. Just stay." The simplicity of it nearly undid him. Daniel set the file down slowly. "Evelyn," he began, and it felt strange to say her name in that office under those lights. "I'm not looking for a fairy tale." Evelyn's laugh was quiet and bitter. "Neither am I." Daniel hesitated, then spoke the truth he had been avoiding. "What happened at the party? If it becomes real, if it becomes something, my son becomes part of the blast radius." Evelyn's gaze sharpened with instinctive protectiveness. "No one would touch him," she said too quickly. Daniel shook his head. "You don't understand," he replied. "People don't have to touch him to hurt him. They can spread stories. They can stalk our home. They can make him a target just because he exists in my life." Evelyn's face tightened, and Daniel realized she did understand. She just didn't want to accept it. "Then we keep it quiet," she said, voice returning to that controlled certainty. "We keep it between us." Daniel stared at her, the phrase echoing like a loop. "Secrets rot," he said. Evelyn rose and stepped closer, stopping just beyond the line of touch. "So does loneliness," she answered. Daniel's chest ached. He thought of Lucas again, of the promise he had made at Emily's grave. I will keep him safe. He also thought of how empty his own life had become, how he had turned himself into a machine for the sake of duty. He looked at Evelyn, this powerful woman trembling with something she had no practice enduring, and he felt the forbidden pull of two wounded people recognizing each other. "If we do this," he said carefully, "there are rules." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Rules?" she repeated, almost amused. "Yes," Daniel insisted. "No contact at work that can be misread, no favoritism, no meetings that can't be explained, and Lucas comes first, always." Evelyn held his gaze for a long beat, then nodded once. "Agreed," she said, and the words sounded like a contract and a confession in one. Daniel exhaled slowly. "And if it starts to threaten him," he added, "I'm gone." Something flickered in Evelyn's eyes, fear, anger, hurt, then she smoothed it away. "Then I'll make sure it doesn't threaten him," she said, and Daniel could hear the vow behind it. They stood in silence, the city pulsing beyond the glass. Evelyn lifted her hand again, the same gesture from the bathroom, and this time she let her fingers brush his knuckles lightly, barely a touch, but enough to send heat through him like a match struck in dry air. Daniel did not pull away. He did not step forward either. They hovered on the edge of something new, something fragile. In that moment, what passed between them wasn't lust, it was relief. Two people realizing they were not entirely alone. They met again 2 nights later in a quiet restaurant Evelyn rented out under a different name. Daniel arrived late, after Lucas was asleep, his guilt heavy as his coat. Evelyn sat in a secluded booth, hair down, wearing a simple sweater instead of a gown, and Daniel almost didn't recognize her. She looked softer, younger, like someone who might have been happy in another life. "You look tired," she said when he slid into the seat across from her. Daniel gave a short laugh. "I am tired," he admitted. Evelyn's gaze lingered on him with a tenderness he didn't expect. "Tell me about him," she said, meaning Lucas. Daniel should have refused. He should have kept the boundary firm. Instead, he found himself talking about Lucas's obsession with space, about the way he asked questions that cut straight to the truth, about the school play Daniel was terrified to miss. Evelyn listened like the words were rare treasure. When Daniel finished, he realized his throat hurt. Evelyn's eyes were bright, but she didn't cry. She simply said, "You built a life from love after loss." Daniel shook his head. "I built it from responsibility," he corrected. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "Love and responsibility aren't enemies," she said. Daniel stared at her, unsure whether to believe her. Outside, weeks passed, and their secret became a rhythm. A late-night call that wasn't saved in records, a private meeting room reserved under a generic name, a look across the boardroom that meant, "Are you okay?" Daniel remained careful, sometimes to the point of cruelty. He never let himself forget the imbalance, the fact that Evelyn could destroy him without trying. Evelyn, in turn, learned to temper her impulses, to accept that Daniel's first loyalty was to a child asleep in a small apartment, not to the glittering empire she ruled. Yet the world around them began to shift. Sophia Lane noticed Daniel's increased proximity to the executive floor. Marcus Hale, a board member with predatory instincts, questioned why Daniel was now included in high-level strategy discussions. Evelyn brushed off the concerns with cold efficiency, but Daniel saw the danger building like pressure behind a dam. One afternoon, Daniel arrived early to pick up Lucas from school and found his son waiting at the gate with a crumpled drawing in his hand. "Dad," Lucas said, voice small. "Is it bad to have a secret?" Daniel's heart stopped. "Why?" he asked carefully, crouching to Lucas's level. Lucas held up the drawing, two stick figures holding hands under a huge star. "I heard kids talking," Lucas said. "They said secrets are lies." Daniel's chest tightened. He wanted to tell his son the truth, that some secrets were shields, not knives, but he couldn't, not yet. "Some secrets are bad," Daniel said slowly. "Some secrets are just private, but if a secret makes you feel scared or lonely, you can always tell me." Lucas nodded, but his eyes searched Daniel's face as if he already sensed something Daniel hadn't said. That night, after Lucas fell asleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table and stared at his phone until the screen dimmed. Evelyn had sent one message. "Are you coming tonight?" Daniel typed, "I can't," then erased it. He typed, "I miss you," then erased it. Finally, he wrote, "We need to talk." In Evelyn's penthouse, she read the message and felt something cold slide beneath her ribs. She had built a life where risks could be calculated, controlled, contained. Daniel Reed was the first risk that did not behave. When he arrived later, face drawn, eyes shadowed, Evelyn didn't offer charm or seduction. She offered honesty. "Tell me," she said. Daniel stood in the doorway like a man about to confess a crime. "People are watching," he said. "My son asked me about secrets." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Lucas is not part of this," she said, too fast. Daniel shook his head. "He already is," he replied. "Because I am." Evelyn stared at him, and for the first time, her power looked useless. "What do you want, Daniel?" she asked, voice low. Daniel's voice broke on the truth. "I want to keep him safe," he said, "and I don't know if I can do that with you." The words hung between them like smoke. Evelyn's eyes flashed, hurt, anger, fear. "So you're leaving," she said, as if naming it would make it bearable. Daniel swallowed hard. "If I have to," he whispered. Evelyn stepped closer, stopping inches away. "You said you weren't looking for a fairy tale," she murmured. "Neither was I. I was looking for something real." Daniel's throat tightened. "Real things can still destroy you," he said. Evelyn's voice hardened. "And empty things can destroy you slowly," she shot back. They stood on opposite sides of the same truth. They had already changed each other, and there was no clean way back. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with a resolve that looked like grief. "I'm going to request a transfer," he said. Evelyn's face went still. "A transfer," she repeated. Daniel nodded. "To another department, less visibility. If that doesn't work, I resign." Evelyn's lips parted, and for a second she looked like she might beg. Then the CEO mask slid back into place, colder than before. "You think you can just step out of my orbit," she said softly, dangerously. Daniel met her gaze without flinching. "I think I have to," he said. Evelyn's eyes glinted with something sharp. "And if I say no?" Daniel's voice was quiet but unmovable. "Then you prove you never cared about anything except having what you want," he said. The accusation wasn't cruel. It was honest. Evelyn's breath caught. For a long moment, the only sound was the city outside the glass, distant and indifferent. Finally, Evelyn's shoulders sank a fraction. "Go," she said. But it wasn't dismissal. It was surrender. Daniel turned to leave. At the door, he paused, unable to stop himself from saying the one thing that made him human. "I didn't choose to feel this," he said, voice rough. "But I do." Evelyn's voice was a whisper when she answered, and it sounded like the bathroom all over again. "So do I," she said. Daniel left, and Evelyn stood alone in the penthouse that had once felt like victory and now felt like a cage. The next day, Marcus Hale requested an emergency board meeting. Rumors had moved faster than Evelyn's defenses. Daniel submitted his transfer request at noon. Sophia Lane watched him with eyes that were too curious. At 4:18 p.m., Daniel's sister called, panic strangling her voice. "Daniel, Lucas is missing." The world tilted. Daniel ran, not thinking, not breathing, his mind filled with only one image, Lucas's small hand in his. He sprinted out of the building, heart hammering, and as he reached the curb, a black car slid to a stop beside him. The window lowered. Evelyn sat inside, face pale, eyes fierce. "Get in," she said. Daniel hesitated for half a second, then climbed in because in that moment pride didn't matter, only Lucas did. Evelyn looked straight ahead as the driver accelerated. "I can help," she said, voice tight. Daniel's throat burned. "This is why I can't," he began. Evelyn cut him off, not with arrogance, but with a raw certainty that sounded like love wearing armor. "This is exactly why you can," she said. "Because when it comes to him, I won't be your danger. I'll be your shield." The car tore through the city with a violence that matched the storm inside Daniel's chest, every red light feeling like a personal betrayal, every second stretching until it hurt. He sat rigid beside Evelyn, his hands braced against his knees as if the motion of the vehicle might fling him apart. His phone lay useless in his palm, the screen dark now that his sister had told him where Lucas was last seen, the words replaying in his head in a loop that refused to slow. Evelyn spoke in clipped, controlled sentences to the driver, to security, to someone at the school, her voice steady in a way that made Daniel both grateful and uneasy. He had never needed power more than he did in that moment, and it terrified him how easily hers wrapped itself around the situation, opening gates he had never known existed. "I should have left sooner," he said finally, the words raw. Evelyn turned to him, her expression stripped of pretense. "You should never have had to choose between love and safety," she replied. "That's not a choice. That's a threat." Daniel looked away, jaw clenched, because arguing would not change the fact that his son was missing, and nothing mattered beyond that singular screaming truth. When they reached the park, the world seemed to contract into one narrow frame, a row of swings, a flickering street lamp, a small figure sitting alone. Daniel was out of the car before it stopped moving, his breath tearing from his chest as he ran. Lucas looked up, eyes wide and frightened, and the sound he made when he recognized his father, half sob, half relief, split Daniel open. He dropped to his knees, pulling his son into his arms with a desperation that left him shaking, whispering apologies and reassurances that tangled together until they were indistinguishable. Lucas clung to him, fingers knotted in his jacket, and Daniel held on as if letting go might undo reality itself. Nearby, the teacher apologized over and over, explaining the confusion, the momentary lapse, but Daniel barely heard her. All he could feel was the weight of Lucas, alive and warm and real, and the way his own heart slowed only when he pressed his forehead to his son's hair. Evelyn stood back, giving them space, but Daniel could feel her presence like a quiet guard at his back, a certainty that something fundamental had shifted. When Lucas was finally calm enough to be coaxed into the car, Evelyn knelt in front of him, her movements careful, deliberate. "I'm Evelyn," she said softly, not as a CEO, not as an authority, but as a woman who understood fear. Lucas studied her face, then nodded, trusting in the way children sometimes did when they sensed sincerity. "Thank you for finding me," he said, and Evelyn's throat tightened as she answered, "I'm very glad we did." That night, after Lucas fell asleep at Daniel's sister's apartment, exhaustion crashed over Daniel like a wave he could no longer outrun. He stood in the kitchen with Evelyn, the overhead light harsh and unflattering, the quiet thick with everything they had not yet said. "This can't continue," Daniel said, finally giving voice to the decision that had been forming long before the park, long before the bathroom, long before he ever allowed himself to imagine Evelyn Carter as anything other than an untouchable force. "Not like this. Not in secret." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of his words, then nodded once. "I know," she replied. "I thought I could control it, control the narrative, control the risk." She let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a laugh. "I forgot that the only thing that doesn't bend to strategy is love." Daniel flinched at the word because hearing it spoken aloud stripped away the last fragile barrier between them. "Lucas comes first," he said again, the rule he had lived by etched into every decision. Evelyn met his gaze without hesitation. He always will, she said, which is why I won't hide anymore. The press conference happened the next morning, swift and unforgiving. Daniel watched it unfold from the couch, Lucas asleep against his shoulder, cartoons flickering silently on the television. Evelyn stood at the podium in a tailored suit that looked more like armor than fashion, her posture unyielding as questions flew like arrows. She did not dodge them. She did not soften the truth. She acknowledged the relationship without romantic language, addressed the imbalance of power with brutal clarity, and announced Daniel's resignation before anyone else could weaponize it. When a reporter asked if she was afraid of the consequences, Evelyn paused, then answered in a voice that carried far beyond the room. I'm afraid of building a life that costs me my humanity, she said. I'm not willing to do that anymore. The room fell silent, and Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. Fear still lived there, but it no longer owned him. When the broadcast ended, Lucas stirred and asked sleepily why so many people were talking about the lady from Dad's work. Daniel kissed his hair, because she told the truth, he said. The weeks that followed were hard in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. Daniel's name appeared in articles he never read aloud, his face captured in grainy photographs taken from too far away. He left Orion Global quietly, without farewell parties or speeches, carrying his belongings in a box that felt absurdly light after years of his life spent there. Evelyn faced the backlash head-on. Board members resigned, investors threatened withdrawal, and old allies vanished with the speed of people who had only ever loved her success. At night, she sat at Daniel's small kitchen table, listening to Lucas chatter about school, learning how to exist in a space where power did not translate to control. Daniel watched her navigate this new reality with a mix of admiration and guilt, aware that loving him had cost her more than he could ever repay. I chose this, she reminded him whenever the doubt crept in. I'm not keeping score. Slowly, a different life took shape. Daniel found work at a smaller firm where his experience mattered more than his notoriety. The pay was modest, but the hours were humane, and he learned to leave the office while the sun was still up. Evelyn learned patience in increments measured by homework sessions and grocery lists, by the quiet triumph of packing a lunch Lucas actually ate. They argued, sometimes fiercely, about boundaries, about fear, about how much of their past to expose to a future that still felt fragile. But the arguments ended not in silence, but in conversation, in the shared understanding that neither of them could afford to retreat into old defenses. One evening, months later, Daniel found Evelyn standing alone on the balcony, the city stretched out before her like a memory she was slowly releasing. Do you miss it? He asked, meaning the power, the certainty, the world that had once bowed to her will. Evelyn considered the question carefully. Sometimes, she admitted, but I don't miss who I was becoming. She turned to him, her expression open in a way it had never been when they first met. I used to think strength meant never needing anyone. Now I think it means choosing someone even when it's inconvenient. Daniel smiled, a small, genuine thing that felt like healing. You chose more than you know, he said. The night Lucas asked if Evelyn could come to his school play, the request landed with the weight of acceptance. Evelyn froze, then looked at Daniel for permission she no longer needed but still respected. Daniel nodded, emotion tightening his throat. I'd like that, Evelyn told Lucas, and the smile he gave her felt like a promise of something real and enduring. Sitting in the auditorium weeks later, surrounded by parents and folding chairs and the unmistakable chaos of children performing, Evelyn felt a peace she had never known on any stage built of glass and steel. Daniel watched her clap too loudly, laugh too freely, and understood that the woman beside him was no longer defined by what she had sacrificed, but by what she had chosen to protect. A year after the night that changed everything, they returned to the hotel where the secret had begun, not for a party, but for closure. They stood outside the ballroom, hands intertwined, the door closed now not by fear, but by memory. If I hadn't pulled you that night, Evelyn said quietly, do you think we'd be here? Daniel thought of the man he had been then, hollowed by loss and duty, afraid of wanting anything for himself. Maybe not, he replied, but I think we would have found each other eventually. Some truths are stubborn like that. Evelyn smiled, leaning into him, and for the first time there was no need to whisper. The secret that had once threatened to destroy them had demanded courage, and in answering it, they had built something stronger than silence, a life where love was no longer hidden, no longer negotiated in shadows, but chosen openly every single day.